Carl Muller adjusted his oil-stained jumpsuit, the fabric worn from years of wrenching on robotic exosuits and delivery drones. At 45, he owned the most reliable mech repair shop in New Dresden, a sprawling metropolis where hover trams wove through steel towers that pierced the artificial sky. His work kept the city's elite moving, but his personal life was as barren as the industrial wastelands beyond the city's edge. After locking the shop security field, Carl opted to walk home, craving the cool, recycled air after a day battling faulty servo motors and demanding clients. The city's lights dimmed to mimic dusk, casting long shadows across the composite walkways. He took the long route through the interspecies market, where traders from distant worlds hawked glowing spices, their voices mingling with the hum of the crowd. The market was a sensory overload, neon signs flickered, and the air carried scent of alien herbs and sizzling street food. Carl usually found solace in the chaos, a distraction from the emptiness of his sleek apartment with its smart appliances and lonely skyline view. That's when he saw her. Tessa Wren, a 10-year-old girl with tangled dark hair and a patched jacket too big for her slight frame. She stood outside a nutrition kiosk, clutching a tattered blanket around a 10-month-old infant, her large, determined eyes locked onto Carl, stopping him mid-stride. "Sir," Tessa said, her voice clear but trembling, "I need milk for my sister. I promise to pay when I grow up." The words hit Carl like a malfunctioning drone. New Dresden's economic downturn had left many families struggling, their lives upended by automation and corporate greed. But Tessa's earnest plea cut through the city's noise. He knelt to her level, noting the dirt smudged on her cheeks and the fierce protectiveness in her gaze. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Tessa Wren," she replied, adjusting the infant. "This is Lila. Our father's sick and can't leave our shelter." "Where's that shelter, Tessa?" Carl asked, his voice soft to avoid startling her. Her eyes darted nervously. "Close," she said, evasive. Carl nodded, respecting her caution. He stood and gestured toward the kiosk. "Let's get that milk." Tessa hesitated, then followed, her small steps quick to match his. Inside, the kiosk stereo lights illuminated rows of nutrient packs and formula. Carl's heart ached at the thought of this child navigating the city alone, her promise echoing with a dignity that felt too heavy for her years. Inside the nutrition kiosk, Carl scanned the shelves, selecting infant formula, nutrient gels, and hygiene patches tailored for a baby's needs. Tessa watched, her eyes wide as the items piled up on the counter. "That's a lot, sir," she whispered, clutching Lila's blanket tighter. Carl managed a small smile, his usual gruff demeanor softening. "Think of it as a loan. You'll pay me back someday, right?" Tessa's weary face broke into a faint smile, her eyes brightening with a spark of hope. She nodded solemnly, as if sealing a sacred pact. They left the kiosk, Tessa clutching the bags with one hand while balancing Lila with the other. Carl walked beside her, slowing his pace to match hers. The city buzzed around them. Hover trams hummed overhead, and market vendors shouted deals in a dozen languages. After a few blocks, Tessa stopped near a shadowed alley beneath the tramline support beams. "This is us," she said, her voice barely audible over the city's din. She glanced at Carl, then darted into the alley. Curiosity and concern tugged at him, and he followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Beneath the tram line, amid crates and discarded insulation, was a makeshift shelter of tarps and scavenged metal. A gaunt man, his face pale and etched with illness, sat propped against a crate. "Tessa, you're back," he rasped, his voice weak but relieved. "Did you find credits?" "A kind man helped," Tessa said, kneeling beside him to unpack the formula. She moved with practiced care, preparing the milk while Lila stirred in her arms. The man, Elias, fed the baby with trembling hands, his eyes soft with love despite his frail state. Carl lingered out of sight, watching the small family. Tessa organized the supplies with a seriousness that belied her age, while Elias whispered thanks to her. Their bond, forged in hardship, radiated a warmth Carl hadn't felt in years. His apartment, with its automated lights and silent rooms, felt like a sterile shell compared to this fragile shelter. As he turned to leave, Tessa's promise echoed in his mind, a vow that carried more weight than any repair contract he'd ever signed. He walked home under the city's artificial stars, the weight of their struggle settling into his chest. That night, Carl lay awake in his too-quiet apartment, Tessa's words looping in his mind. I promise to pay when I grow up. The city's hum, once a comforting constant, now felt hollow. By morning, he was back at the market, navigating stalls of alien fruits and tech gadgets. He bought nutrient packs, medical gels for Elias's condition, and a hollow tablet loaded with children's learning programs. His arms full, he returned to the alley, feeling like an intruder in his oil-stained jumpsuit. Elias looked up as Carl approached, pulling Lila close. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse and suspicious. "Just to help," Carl said, setting the bags down gently. "Why?" Elias's eyes narrowed, his distrust palpable. "People don't give without expecting something." "Not this one," Carl replied, his tone steady. "I just want to make things easier." Elias studied him, then nodded slightly, allowing Tessa to take the supplies. Over the next week, Carl became a regular visitor, bringing clothes, toys, and more food. Tessa's guarded demeanor softened with each visit. She began sharing her dreams of becoming an engineer, her eyes lighting up as she described fixing drones like Carl. One afternoon, as they sat on a crate sharing a nutrient bar, she tilted her head. "Are you rich?" Carl chuckled, rubbing his stubble jaw. "I do all right." "Why?" "You bring so much," Tessa said, her voice earnest. "You must have a big heart." The words caught Carl off guard, stirring something he couldn't name. He thought of his wealth, credits amassed from years of tireless work, but had never filled the void of his solitary life. Tessa's stories, her quiet resilience, began to chip away at his walls. He started lingering longer in the alley, listening as she described imaginary machines she'd build someday. Elias, too, began to open up, sharing snippets of his past as a factory worker before illness stole his strength. Each visit left Carl feeling lighter, as if the family's warmth was seeping into the cracks of his lonely existence. By the week's end, he realized he was no longer just dropping off supplies. He was building connection, one small act at a time. 3 weeks later, Carl was elbow deep in a drone's propulsion unit when a sharp pain stabbed his chest. His vision blurred, his breath caught, and he collapsed onto the shop's cold floor, barely activating his emergency beacon. At the hospital, the diagnosis was blunt: stress-induced cardiac strain. "You need to slow down," the doctor said, her voice clinical. "Find something worth living for, or you won't make it to 50. As Carl recovered, scrolling through schematics on his tablet, the hospital door slid open. Elias stood there, holding Lila, with Tessa clutching a crumpled hollow flyer displaying Carl's face from a local news report about workplace stress. "We thought you'd left us," Tessa said, rushing to his bedside, her voice small. "Like Mama did." The words pierced Carl deeper than the pain in his chest. He reached out, squeezing her hand. "I'm not going anywhere, kid." Tessa and her family visited daily, bringing small gifts, a woven bracelet from plant fibers, a tiny drone Tessa had cobbled together from scraps. Lila babbled, reaching for Carl's fingers with chubby hands. Elias shared stories of his old job, his hopes to give his daughters a stable life despite their mother's absence. Each visit filled Carl's sterile hospital room with life. Tessa's chatter about circuits and gears made him laugh, while Lila's giggles softened the edges of his recovery. Elias's quiet gratitude, once guarded, now carried warmth. One evening, Tessa showed Carl a drawing on a scrap of packaging, a stick figure family with her, Lila, Elias, and a tall figure she shyly labeled Carl. He stared at it, his throat tight. The family's presence was a lifeline, pulling him from the isolation he'd lived in for years. He began to see his collapse not as a failure, but as a wake-up call. His wealth, his shop, his endless work, they meant nothing without connection. As Tessa tucked the drawing beside his bed, Carl realized he'd found something worth living for, something he hadn't known he needed until a child's promise showed him the way. On the day of his discharge, Carl sat with Elias in the hospital's dim light, Lila asleep in her father's arms. "Come live with me," Carl said, the words spilling out with surprising certainty. "Not as charity, as family." Elias's eyes searched Carl's face, wary but hopeful. "And if it fails?" "We'll figure out," Carl said firmly, "but it's better than the alley." The transition to Carl's apartment was awkward at first. The sleek space, with its automated lights and silent rooms, felt foreign to Tessa's endless energy and Lila's curious crawling. Elias cooked simple meals, filling the air with a comforting scent of stews and bread. Tessa turned every corner into a playground, building forts from cushions, while Lila's giggles echoed off the walls. Carl found himself leaving work early, eager to hear Tessa's latest invention ideas or help Elias with Lila's bedtime routine. The apartment, once a sterile shell, began to feel like a home. One evening, as they watched the city's lights from the balcony, Tessa tugged Carl's sleeve. "Can I call you Papa?" Her voice was small, hopeful. Carl's heart skipped, a warmth spreading through him. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elias, overhearing, approached slowly, Lila dozing against his shoulder. "And me?" he asked quietly, his eyes meeting Carl's. "I'd like to be your partner," Carl said, "if you'll have me." The words hung in the air, a quiet promise. Elias nodded, a faint smile breaking through his guarded expression. Over the next months, their lives wove together. Tessa's laughter filled the mornings, her makeshift gadgets cluttering the counters. Lila took her first wobbly steps toward Carl, her tiny hands reaching for him. Elias's health improved, his strength returning with proper care. Carl hired assistants to handle the shop's routine repairs, freeing him to spend evenings teaching Tessa basic circuitry or reading to Lila. The family's presence transformed his once empty life. Each day a reminder that love, not credits, was what made a home. 6 months later, Carl's life was unrecognizable. His apartment overflowed with Tessa's inventions, wire and scrap contraptions that buzz and whirred, while Lila's toys littered the floor. Elias, now healthier, worked part-time with Community Support Network, helping other struggling families. Tessa called Carl Papa with ease, and Lila's first word, a garbled "pa," brought tears to his eyes. The shop still thrived, but Carl no longer lived for it. His evenings were for his family, for Tessa's stories and Elias's quiet smiles. One night, after tucking Lila into bed, Carl proposed formalizing their bond, adopting Tessa and Lila, united with Elias in a legal ceremony blending city traditions. Tessa overheard, tackling Carl in a joyful hug. "We're a real family now," she cried, her eyes bright. "We always were," Carl said, ruffling her hair, his heart full. A year later, their home was alive with Tessa's creations, Lila's laughter, and Elias's potted herbs thriving on every windowsill. One morning, as Carl sipped coffee, Tessa approached with serious expression. "Papa, remember my promise to pay you back?" He nodded, smiling. "I do. When I grow up, I'll build homes for kids like me and Lila," she said, her voice firm. "Safe places with lights and warmth. Is that okay?" Carl pulled her close, his eyes misty. "That's the best payment I could ever ask for." The apartment, once silent, now hummed with life. Tessa's drawings covered the walls, each one a testament to their bond. Lila toddled after Carl, calling Pa with glee. Elias's laughter, once rare, filled their evenings. As Carl looked at his family, he marveled at how Tessa's promise had reshaped his world. He'd been wealthy but empty, his days measured in credits and repairs. Now, surrounded by love, he knew the true value of a promise kept, not in credits, but in the family that had made his heart whole.